In terms of the range of issues that have been occurring since last time we met, we want to talk briefly through the issues in relation to recruitment and selection within the public sector, in relation to the public sector reform process, and where that's at in terms of both the parliamentary and committee process, and also in relation to the public sector wage negotiations for the core public service. So most of the information we'll be providing today is designed for public servants employed outside of health and education, because there are some differences in relation to both the wages issues, but also in terms of the FDE recruitment and selection processes within those two agencies. So if you are from those agencies and dialed in, please just seek clarification from your organisers about whether the material provided will be specific to you, specific to just the public service areas, or whether it'll cover also education and health as well. So as we talked about last time, the state government has kind of developed their proposals in relation to managing the savings and debt plan, which has kind of 6 or 7 subcomponents that we talked through at the last meeting. Since the last meeting, we have been able to get some further clarification and detail from the Public Service Commission about exactly what is being proposed by government, and I'll talk that through in a moment. And then subsequent to that information, Together is continuing to engage with government at 3 levels to try and get an understanding of what's going on, but also to ensure that workers have a real voice in this process, and that you're not penalised as a result of the decisions being made by government to respond to the budgetary circumstances created by the pandemic and the resulting economic downturn. So in terms of what we've got at the moment, and we'll be able to distribute post today's meeting as part of the PowerPoint, is the Public Service Commission documentation, which is a system approach to managing workforce growth, which is reasonably consistent with the material that we covered in the last union briefing session, which basically is that there will be a 3 system approach to the management of the workforce and recruitment and selection. That will be one set of rules for all, but at a local level implementation between what our systems employers, being Queensland Health being one system, Education Queensland being a second system, and the rest of the public service being a 3rd system. So some of these rules apply to all 3, but there are then some local implementation issues. So basically what the material that we've now got does indicate, which is consistent with our interpretation a fortnight ago, is that the government is maintaining that they have an FTE cap, a full-time equivalent cap, but for those areas which are driven by demand, in their view, being education and health, they're allowed to grow beyond their FTE cap based on that growth. With outside education and health, if there is going to be increasing staffing numbers to deal with frontline workers, they require government approval to increase the size of the workforce. But beyond that, then there is, while the FTE cap, as approved, stays within each agency, there are a set of rules and regulations that have been adopted by the government in relation to how vacancies will be managed within each of the 3 systems. And I'll talk about the non-health, non-education system primarily today. But in terms of the process, basically each agency is required to get sign-off from the Public Service Board, which is not just the Public Service Commission, but it's the Directors General Leadership Group, which sits above the Public Service Commission. They're required to get approval for a definition of what is frontline. So previously, pre the Bridgman and Coldrake reviews, there was the Murray data being collected that was published by the Public Service Commission on a quarterly basis. That moved to a 6-monthly basis after the Coldrake review. But that had frontline support as well as other. What the current rules and regulations that have been produced by government in relation to the process for recruitment and selection within the public sector has removed the concept of frontline support. And as part of that process, there is frontline and other now. That doesn't apply to the Murray reporting, but just in relation to the recruitment and selection processes. So what that has also meant as a corollary is that each agency is now been required to put to the Public Service Board a definition of who within their agency is frontline in the new definition. So what that has meant that and we haven't seen the details of that on an agency by agency basis yet, but certainly where we've had some more detailed discussions in Queensland Health, we have seen that there is a number of frontline support positions have now been defined as frontline. And that is likely to be the case, we think, in Education Queensland, and then within each agency, within the rest of the public service, it will depend on the decisions made by the Public Service Board in relation to that definition. So that is stage one. Then stage two is that if you are seeking to have the recruit on a permanent basis to a vacancy within the front line, and that front line is within your existing cap. So if you have, say, 1,000 child safety officers was your cap, and one of those people resigned or retired, and you wanted to permanently fill that position, you would require the system manager to seek that approval. Initially, there would be some other processes I'll talk about in a second, but so the system manager has the ability to approve permanent recruitment for frontline positions where the agency is recruiting within the previously approved FTE cap. So that kind of will effectively mean that for agencies outside of education and health, they will require the Public Service Commissioner to sign off on recruitment activities in relation to frontline staff. In health and education, the Director General of those two agencies will be the one who would make the approval for the permanent recruitment of frontline positions. To do that, though, they've also still got to jump through a number of hoops first before they go to external filling, and that is that they've got to look at either internal transfers within the sector or in relation to internal advertising. So we will see, in terms of the advertising of permanent positions within the public service, a number of those positions starting to be advertised in the frontline areas on a permanent basis, but only available for other public servants or broadly within Queensland Health public sector workers, the ability for those people to apply for positions rather than those positions being open to more generic advertising. That's going to work at one level in relation to higher level positions, but certainly at base grade positions, the expectation that they will have to move to continue to advertise externally because there isn't the internal labour market that would allow for those positions to be filled. For those positions, though, that fall outside of the frontline definition, they will still have the first two steps that will be required. That is in relation to before they can externally advertise. They've got to look to internal processes. But the way that the documentation has been set, and certainly the way it's been explained to us in the briefings, is that where if it's a frontline position, the Public Service Commissioner has the ability to approve the advertising of those positions. The second, for non-frontline positions on a permanent basis, would require the approval by the Cabinet Budget Review Committee, which is the leadership, the smaller group of Cabinet of 4 and now 5 senior ministers who make the key budgetary decisions. So in terms of that committee, in the way that the government has drafted this process, that committee approves if the government wants to move from, say, 1,000 police officers to 1,100 police officers, that requires a CBRC decision. But what they're now saying in terms of this process is that the government is saying that if they want to permanently advertise a position for for a non-frontline position, first of all, you've got to look at internally filling it. But if you want to externally advertise any position in a non-frontline capacity, that would then require a decision of CBRC. Clearly, that is a unsustainable position from the union's perspective. In terms of that process, we would be talking about 50 to 60,000 workers in the non-health, non-education space, and so therefore the ability to have the number of vacancies being approved by CBRC is farcical. In terms of that process, there is also the processes have been developed in a complete vacuum of the industrial entitlements that you have, and they vary from enterprise bargaining agreement to enterprise bargaining agreement. So in terms of a union response, we're working on this on 3 levels. The first level is to try and engage with the Public Service Board and with the government more broadly to urge them to fundamentally rethink the approach being taken in relation to the establishment management process. From our point of view, it's not clear how much of this is based on a CBRC decision and how much of this is based on the implementation decisions being made by the Public Service Commission and the Public Service Board. But whoever was responsible for the decisions, we say needs to be, that the whole process needs to be fundamentally revisited in terms of that process. So we are continuing to meet with senior management at the Director General level in relation to that. And we are going to be having further meetings in the next couple of days. And we've also written to the members of the CBRC and particularly the Treasurer and the Premier to indicate that we feel that that whatever this process is, the government needs to either change their decision at CBRC, or if they're not changing their decision and it's an implementation issue, they need to intervene in the implementation process to avoid what would be a catastrophic process moving forward in relation to bringing recruitment and selection within the public sector to a complete halt. In terms of this process, this is also happening outside of any budgetary considerations. At this stage, there is no budget for the 2021 year. The budget was due to be handed down in May. It was going to be brought down early to align with the federal budget. Post-COVID, both budgets have been delayed. The Commonwealth budget is due in the 6th of October, which is also when the state government goes into caretaker period prior to the 31 October election. So our assessment at this point in time is that there will be some sort of economic statement as required made prior to the state election. But it's likely that the state government departments and agencies will continue to operate without a formal budget until after the state election, and that we're in a kind of no man's land in relation to rolling over last year's budget at one level, but having significant attempts to wind back expenses and look at savings in relation to within that context, but without a formal budgetary outcome about that. So I know we've had some questions about whether there's going to be VERs and redundancies out of this process. There isn't any indication of that at this stage, and they would normally be something that would be connected to a budgetary savings measure. But in the absence of a budget, there's been no discussion about that. So at the moment, all this really has been is limited to an attempt to manage the recruitment and selection process within the sector, primarily focusing on non-frontline. There is a number of parenthood statements around what might have happened in the frontline area, but that is clearly something that we are trying to deal with at a sector-wide level. At a secondary level, what we are also seeking to do is enforce your industrial rights and entitlements. So in terms of that, different enterprise bargaining agreements, we've been have different outcomes where members have been strongest. We have better guarantees in terms of the industrial entitlements about workload and filling of vacancies. And so we are going to be prosecuting those cases through the Industrial Relations Commission to complement our negotiations with government. We're not working on the basis, we're working on the basis that those negotiations won't achieve an outcome. So we've got to do other processes as well. So that is primarily going to be through an industrial response using the rights and entitlements you've won through collective bargaining to try and force outcomes. So in terms of Queensland Health, they'll be the first cab off the rank in terms of that industrial process. We're doing that on the basis that they have we've been able to win the strongest outcomes for members in Queensland Health based on their industrial strength. They've just had their collective bargaining agreement certified in the last couple of days. Now they're certified, we'll be seeking to prosecute the rights and entitlements that we have in those agreements to fundamentally challenge the principles of the kind of the FTE process being proposed by government, because the two are in fundamental contradiction, and that the Queensland Health Agreement requires jobs to be filled, and the announcements made by government, particularly in relation to non-frontline within health, says that CBRC has to sign off on any agreement before those agreements can be permanently filled. So we will see some work initially in Queensland Health, but probably also then in the core to look at notifying of industrial disputes and industrial processes, to try and prosecute our argument with government more broadly about why the system is failing, but also ensuring that workers don't get penalised through this process by having more and more vacancies unfilled, which will put more and more pressure on the remaining workforce to continue to deliver the same outcomes with less staff. And that will have a dramatic impact on the workload for staff, as well as fundamentally compromising the ability to provide services to workers, and also in places like payroll, the ability to provide outcomes for workers in terms of making sure that people's pay is appropriately being processed. So in terms of that, the industrial mechanisms we will use will vary slightly by agreement. So what we're likely to be doing in the core is the same objective, but through a slightly different industrial mechanism, which will be more workload focused, compared to the dispute process or the enforcement process within Queensland Health, which will be more focused on the wording of their agreement. So that's where that secondary stage is at, and that'll be happening over the next couple of days in terms of those two processes. And then thirdly, we've also written to every government department in terms of seeking an agency level consultation around the implementation of the system approach to managing workforce growth. Because while some of this decision making resides at the Public Service Board and the Public Service Commission in terms of the definition of what is frontline, there is still a series of steps that the agency needs to take prior to seeking the Public Service Commission approval, either to recruit permanently to frontline positions or seeking approval of the CBRC processes for non-frontline positions. So what we're seeking at the agency level is direct consultation around what is the revised definition of frontline, because at this point in time, given the collapsed nature of the definitions and the lack of a frontline support definition, we don't know at this stage whether each agency has approval yet from the Public Service Board for those decisions, and secondly, what they are, but then how management will be then working through the decisions that they need to make within this framework. First of all, the first round of decisions that the agencies will have to make is in the existence of a vacancy. Do they want that job still? Is that job going to be abolished? If they're going to abolish that job, what happens to the work it was doing? Secondly, are they looking potentially at using either labour hire or temporary employment to fill these vacancies? Because while the government at one level is saying they're more committed to permanency of employment and employment security, the rules that have been set up as they currently sit is that agencies will have a vested interest and incentive to use labour hire or temporary employment, because different sets of rules apply to recruitment for those groups than do for permanent staff. So while the government is saying one thing about employment security in terms of the Public Service Act, their behaviour in terms of a budgetary process and the decisions of the Public Service Commission, the Public Service Board, are running completely contrary to the notions of seeking a more permanent public service. And then also, if decisions are being made not to fill positions, what does that mean for the workload? Because clearly in terms of if there are 6 people working and 1 or 2 of those people retire or resign or get promoted elsewhere, what will happen to the rest of the workforce, and how do they manage the workload expectations with 1/3 or 1/4 of the staff having gone? or those vacancies existing. So what you'll see over the short period will be hopefully engagement with government and having a rational conversation about reforming this process. Secondly, you're likely to see some information in the near future about our industrial practices through the Industrial Commission to try and prosecute this. And thirdly, you'll see hopefully some response from agencies, but certainly the agency consultative committees in each agency having this listed as an agenda. But in terms of that process, you also shouldn't assume just because the employer has told you what's going on, they've told your union. So it's important that delegates and members, if they are getting feedback from agencies about new processes and policies about recruitment and selection, or that your department's approach to the system for managing workforce growth, if you could let that your local delegates, your local organisers know, so we can take that up as quickly as possible. But we'll also be providing information as soon as we get it on an agency by agency basis as to where your consultative committees are at, and whether we've got more specific details about what is the definition of frontline for your area, what is the process for filling of vacancies, and what is going to mean for workload. Then the third element, in terms of that process, that's really been the major focus of what we're trying to do to win for workers over the last couple of weeks, because it really is getting to a crisis point unless we're able to address those issues clearly and concisely and address those issues head on, particularly as the clock is ticking before we get to caretaker mode, and then potentially post caretaker mode, kind of the challenges of dealing with either a re-elected government or a newly elected LNP government will mean that the ability for decision making in early November may become more challenging. So we're potentially facing a kind of almost a 2-month period or longer where if we don't address the rules now, the systems will become more and more dysfunctional as we move forward. But as part of that, we still do have one more sitting week of Parliament under the current Parliament, and we have got the Public Service Act amendments being discussed. We've put forward the submission based on the feedback from members. We had a hearing in relation to the committee Monday a week ago, where myself and James Swan and the Vice President for the Public Service Division, as well as Kate Flanders, the Assistant Branch Secretary, prosecuted our arguments. But in terms of process, concurrently with the Public Service Act review and the amendments and that committee process, we've also been negotiating with the Public Service Commission about the new directives that would underpin the legislation if it gets passed. And we have deep concerns in relation to those directives. I think our concerns about the nature of the Act not going far enough and having to be underpinned by details within the legislation. The nature of those directives, I think, is fundamentally concerning to the union, particularly in relation to the temporary conversion process that we will having to escalate back to the committee and back more broadly with Parliament to say that we can't have our rights and entitlements maintained within the directives, because we've seen good improvements in the Act in relation to temporary conversions and right of access to the Industrial Relations Commission, and trying to limit the scope for non-conversion. But at the same time, there's a draft directive we were given by the Public Service Commission 2 days ago for comment by tomorrow, which kind of reopens the loophole. So the more we tighten up the Act, the more the directive appears to be opening up complete discretion for Directors General to not convert people, but also to try and drag in some of the concepts within the workforce management process to say that's another excuse to say temporaries shouldn't be converted because they're kind of the misnomer of workforce growth, which is really about workforce contraction, is being used to stop the entitlements of temporary employees to become permanent in this context. So in terms of that, we have got strong support from members through the petition process, calling on the committee to try and guarantee your rights in the Act rather than in the directives. We'll be prosecuting that case. We've met with a number of the members of the committee as well as the committee itself, and we'll need to get that argument going. But we'll only win in that argument if we have your support in that process. I really would encourage, if you haven't signed the petition yourself, please sign the petition, but also to circulate that petition to your colleagues to make sure that we have as strong a voice as possible with the politicians to make them understand that this is an issue that public sector workers care deeply about. So just as they will be looking for you to vote for them in October, you should be asking them to make sure that they are doing what they should as elected politicians to show real leadership in terms of protecting and improving your rights at work and improving this Act, and not relying on the Public Service Commission directives to provide you with those rights and entitlements is a clear outcome that we'll be looking at doing. So in terms of that process, we're on track for it. The committee will report it, will provide its report next week, but it really is important that we get members involved in that initial petition process to the committee. But once the committee hands down a report, we will still have that window between now and early September to try and maximise our engagement with politicians, both ministers and MPs, to make sure that those amendments go as far as possible in terms of delivering a real outcome for not only for casual and temporary conversion, but also for higher duties. Because one of the real loopholes at the moment is that the Act and the subsequent directive really kind of relies on merit before people can be converted for higher duties, which is leaving a Pandora's box open with the ability for employers not to put people on higher duties without a merit process, and then having people having years of employment, of income insecurity without the ability to be converted. So if you have two people next to each other, the temporary could get converted, but the person on higher duties could lose their income overnight because of that loophole. So those are really big issues, as well as the kind of discipline investigations and things. We do need your support in that. So it really is important that you fill in that petition, but also as leaders in your workplace, if you can encourage as many other members as possible just to take the time to make their voice heard. It's a critical time over the next 10 days to get that petition finalised prior to the committee, but then use that as the launching pad for a last push in relation to political engagement with MPs and ministers, particularly in target electorates in the marginal seats and where there's a committee members, to maximise our chances of getting those politicians to do something in a meaningful way in the last sitting week of September. Please stay involved, get active, but I think we've lost sound. So thanks everybody for participating, and we'll get that information out to you as soon as possible, and we'll take it from there. So thank you everybody.